Good morning. This is day 32. We have reached the book of Lamentations. I just want to show you, look how far we've come, look how much we've covered. In fact, there's a bit of index there, so it doesn't even go quite to the end of the New Testament there. So although we probably aren't quite halfway through the videos yet, because the books get shorter in the New Testament, we have covered a lot of scripture. I used covered slightly disingenuously, I guess, because obviously we have just skated over things. But I hope you're getting a flavour of some of these books, and I hope that you are inspired to dig deeper into them for yourself. Today we've reached the book of Lamentations, which may be quite unfamiliar to you. It's not something that we tend to use very much in church, although there are one or two really well-known worship songs that come from here, actually. But of which probably the best known is Great is Thy Faithfulness, and I'll show you that bit in due course this morning. But by and large, this is not a book that we focus on very much. I wonder when you last heard it preached from, for example, or even used in liturgy. But when we overlook this book, I think we are missing a hidden gem that is within Scripture for us. And I'll talk you through that a little bit now. So who wrote, well, let's talk about the setting actually of the book of Lamentations first. So the Lamentations is set after the utter destruction of Jerusalem. We've spoken quite a bit about that historical setting, both in our Kings videos and in the Jeremiah videos that we've done in the last couple of days. Lamentations is, it's set after Babylon has done that second wave of attack against Jerusalem and has destroyed it completely. Lamentations takes us into that ransacked city and weeps with the remnant who live there and with those who have been taken far from it, and expresses the grief of the people. Excuse me. So it is traditionally understood to have been written by Jeremiah, although actually the Hebrew doesn't attribute it at all, the Hebrew Bible. The early Greek translation, which was done before the time of Christ, is called the Septuagint. So the early Greek translation of the Old Testament does attribute it to Jeremiah. But it's not entirely clear where it got that attribution from, because, as I say, it isn't found in the Hebrew. The King James Version picks up on that and attributes it to Jeremiah, which means that many of us have grown up assuming that this is Jeremiah, and it may not be. But do you know what? It doesn't really make a lot of difference. One of the interesting things about this book, actually, is that whoever wrote it, and it may be more than one person actually, because it's 5 discrete poems really which have been put together. But whoever has written it has kind of assumed different voices within those poems. Don't misunderstand me. This isn't an attempt to deceive, but this is this is a literary device whereby the poet takes us into different points of view. And expresses the lament from different points of view. I'll show you some of that in just a moment. So this book is, as I've said already, comprised of 5 different poems which are put together. Now, I mentioned, I don't know, a few videos back, that the chapter breaks in the Bible are not original and are not always very helpful. There are exceptions to that. The Psalms would be one, although even in the Psalms there are places where sometimes we have 2 Psalms, we have 2 chapters, and probably they're supposed to be read together. In Lamentations, the chapter breaks probably are original in the sense that, well, actually we can see that the poems end at the end of each chapter. So each chapter is a self-contained poem. And the reason we know that is because of the use of the acrostic device. Now, we spoke about this when we were talking about Psalms a few, about a week ago. An acrostic, if you remember, as it's used in the Hebrew Bible, is when each stanza of the poem begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and if you glance at the Book of Lamentations, you'll see chapter 1 has 22 verses. And the reason is because each of those verses begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 2, have a little look, has 22 verses. Each of those verses begins with a fresh letter of the Hebrew alphabet, working through in order. Leave chapter 3 for a moment. Chapter 4 also has 22 verses for the same reason. Now, chapter 3 is interesting because it has 66 verses, which of course is 3 times 22. And what you see in chapter 3 is a triple acrostic. So it has 3 verses within each stanza, if you like. So it goes Aleph, 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 which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Bet, 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 the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so on, all the way down. So this is a highly stylized, highly skillful poem. The interesting thing in chapter 5 is that there are still 22 verses, but there is no acrostic. So what's going on here? Well, the thing about an acrostic, which I think I mentioned when we talked about Psalms, is it is something like an A to Z. It is it expresses something of completeness. It's kind of tidy. So there is something about these acrostics in this book of Lament over Jerusalem, which, first of all, it keeps moving. You can't kind of dwell in one place because the force of the poetry drives you onwards to the next and the next and the next. But it also provides a structure for the expression of grief, and it it expresses the completeness of grief. But by the time you get to chapter 5, we've only got a kind of gesture towards that structure with the 22 verses, and yet the acrostic itself is broken down. And maybe there is something here that is talking about this sense of breakdown structure that will be experienced within the city in this time of disorder and after the loss of after the breakdown of the wall and the sacking of the city. We can overinterpret that, but I wonder if there is clearly something very powerful going on with the use of structure here. And so the breakdown in the final chapter may be indicative of something like that. I'll give you an example it's very hard to render this acrostic into English, but a scholar called David Slavitt has done a kind of loose translation that tries to represent that. So if you've got the text in front of you, you might like to turn to chapter 3, and I'm going to give you David Slavitt's translation of the first few verses to try and show you how this acrostic is working. Afflicted am I and beset, a man whom God in his wrath has abased. Abused by his rod and broken, I am driven into the darkness. Against me he turned his hand, and again. Bones broken, wasted, I am besieged and battered. Bitterness is my portion and tribulation. Banished, I dwell in the deepest darkness like those long dead. Chained so I cannot escape, and walled in I am a captive. Crying for help I call out, but he will not hear my prayer. Crooked are all my paths which he has blocked with boulders. I hope you kind of get the idea of how this works. Now, while we're talking about poetry, we should talk about the rhythm as well. Now, I'm not going to try. My spoken Hebrew, my read Hebrew is quite poor, although I can translate it, I can study it. But in terms of speaking it aloud, I think I'm not going to commit myself to doing that publicly in this way, because I know that those who know better would be probably horrified by my pronunciation and so on. But the rhythm of this book in Hebrew largely falls into what is known as a kina rhythm. Kina is the Hebrew for grief or mourning, or is kind of the wailing of a lament. And what you tend to get is you get 5 words, which is the first 3, and then a break, as it were, and then the last 2. And so it's not matched lines. It's a kind of, there's a length and then a kind of, it sort of limps into the second half of each couplet. And this is a classic kina rhythm, and a lot of Lamentations is written in this rhythm. we need to notice that there is personification going on in Lamentations. If you've forgotten what personification is, it's when a non-human entity is given human characteristics and attributes. Now, I have mentioned a few times that Jerusalem is often personified. Well, I mentioned, I think, that the people of God, Israel, are personified as a woman, often the wife of God. Jerusalem here is personified as a woman, and we will see that a number of times. And this leads us to talk about the voices with which the poet speaks, which I have already started to refer to. So if you've got the book open, you might like to have a look at this with me. In chapter 1, the first half of chapter 1, it feels a bit like a war reporter who walks in to the city, to this abandoned city, with an element of objectivity, not coldness, but an element of objectivity, a kind of war reporter who goes, oh, look at this, look at these devastated buildings, look at these people, and kind of talks you through what they are observing. So, for example, let me just read you the first 2 or 3 verses. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations. She who is a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks among all her lovers. She has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Jerusalem has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan, and so on. So it's like this reporter. I mean, obviously it's poetic, and there is a kind of there's a theological element here as well. But the reporter is saying, look, once this was a bustling city, and now it's devastated and silent. It's that kind of thing. Perhaps you can see what I mean. A different voice breaks in halfway through verse 11 of the first chapter, where Jerusalem herself speaks as this personified woman for a few verses. Listen. Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see, is there any sorrow like mine, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger? From on high he sent fire, into my bones he made it descend. He spread a net for my feet. He turned me back, he has left me stunned, faint, all the day long. So this is the voice of Jerusalem, if you like. We continue to hear those 2 voices really through the rest of the first 2 chapters. In chapter 3, the voice is said by some to be the voice of a defeated soldier, a veteran of the siege, who describes his own sense of grief, of woundedness, and here the dominant image is of encirclement. I'll read you the first 3 verses and then skip on to verse 7. This is chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction. Under the rod of his wrath he has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. Actually, I'll just continue in verse 4. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. And so on. This you can see this dominant image of encirclement, which of course reflects the siege that has happened. You can see this this image of physical affliction, and you can see that it is a male voice now, unlike the female voice that we had a few minutes ago. Chapter 4 has been described, at least by one scholar, as the voice of the bourgeois citizen. So if the elite citizen has been taken away, and the most devastated have perhaps had their expression earlier in the chapter, in the books rather, then here perhaps we see the voice of the kind of middle class who is marvelling at the way that the poor have been, well, sorry, the way that the rich have been devastated, commenting on the economic hardship. Chris Wright describes this as the average citizen who is amazed and gratified at the reversal. I wonder if that's a little strong, but we certainly see this attention to the economic hardship that is being experienced. I'll read you the first few verses of chapter 4. How the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. The holy stones lie scattered at the head of every street. Verse 4, second half. The children beg for food, but no one gives to them. Those who once feasted on delicacies perished in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple embrace ash heaps. In chapter 5, the voice is that of the community. This is a communal lament. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows, and so on. So I hope you can see that there are different voices that are finding expression within this, each of them with their own expression of the grief and lament that they feel. Now, where is God in this book of Lamentations? Because God is silent. God never speaks in this book. Now here I'm borrowing some ideas from a scholar called Kathleen O'Connor and Chris Wright. And Chris Wright's book, The Message of Lamentations, which is a short and accessible commentary on this book, is wonderful, and I commend it to you. And he lays open some of these ideas much more fully than I'm able to express them to you in this short video. So this silence of God may trouble some, but God being silent doesn't mean that he's not listening. And we get a clue to this in Psalms. In Psalm 56 verse 8, we read this. And the psalmist to God, you have kept count of my tossings, this idea of tossing and turning and the wrestling and the struggling. You have put your tears in my bottle. Are they not in your record? And it has been suggested by Kathleen O'Connor and picked up by Chris Wright that what we have in the Book of Lamentations is, if you like, the bottle for the tears of the people of God at this moment in history. It is a record, a collection of the grief of the people. It is as if God has collected the tears in this bottle and they are documented here. They are inscribed for generations to come. That's the first thing to say, that God is attentive, I think, to the grief of the people. Now, this as I mentioned, a book with 5 chapters. There's a real symmetry about this because the middle chapter is the longest. And at the heart of the middle chapter, we get perhaps the theological heart of this book. Listen, verses 31 to 33 of chapter 3. The Lord will not cast off forever, but though he causes grief, he will have compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not willingly afflict or grieve the children of men. This is perhaps, as I say, the central theological statement, that God's steadfast love endures. And we have actually seen another reference to that in a very famous 2 or 3 verses, in 3 verse 21. This I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. There is something, however, about the silence of God in this book that is even more powerful yet. And Kathleen O'Connor says it gives this book a daring power because it honours human speech. As soon as God speaks, humans have to be silent. And if God broke in too quickly, there might be a negation of human suffering, a negation of the human voice that expresses lament. And God remaining silent means that he can be attentive and the human voices are free to express their lament. Having said that, the human lament here does not go unanswered. And one of the best places to see the answer to that is in Isaiah chapter 40 to 55. And we looked at this a few days ago. But Isaiah 40 opens up the comfort that is coming to the people after the catastrophic events which Lamentations is grieving for. And Isaiah 40 to 55 kind of addresses every grief that is expressed in Lamentations, almost as if it is a kind of a pairing with this book. I don't know if it is really, but it certainly functions that way. So Zion mourns that there is no one to comfort her, and Isaiah expresses the comfort of God for his people. Zion grieves for the loss of her children, and Isaiah foresees the return of Zion's children and their multiplication once again in the city. The roads to Jerusalem are described as deserted here, and Isaiah expresses the day when Jerusalem will once again be filled with joy at the return of the exiles. Zion has fallen, in this personified woman, has fallen to the ground naked and unclean, and Isaiah uses that same female personification and describes and summons the woman to shake off the dust and dress herself once more in fine clothes. So all of these kind of poetic images that express grief and loss and pain in Lamentations are picked up and kind of transformed in the comfort that is expressed in that part of Isaiah. It's extraordinary. Let me just say a final few comments about the neglect of lament in our own churches. And I mentioned this, I referred to this briefly when we were talking about Psalms. I'll just tell you a personal story, actually. I think it was after the Manchester bombings, in that stadium, in that concert hall. And I think those took place on a Friday, if I remember. The details of the story are slightly hazy, but the point is very pressing, I think. So I went to church that particular Sunday with those events still very much in my heart, and I was grieving as so much of the nation was for the atrocity that had been performed just a few hours before. And it was a service I wasn't participating, I wasn't leading, I was just in the congregation. It wasn't my own church, actually. And I went there with this sense of grief and rage and pain. And I'm sure I wasn't the only person in the congregation who was feeling those things that day. And I walked into church, and you would not know that these events had happened. We went straight into a really kind of joyful song of triumph and victory, and it did not meet where I was, and it didn't provide me with a place to bring my rage and my grief and my lament and my questions to God. To me, it was a completely emotional mismatch. Now, we will always, to some extent, when we design our church services, mismatch where some members of our congregation are, because people come to church with a whole range of emotions at any one Sunday. But there are times in the life of our churches when actually there is a corporate emotion that is being experienced. That was one of those Sundays, I think. And on days like that, we are given lament in the Bible to encourage us and to give us permission to express that grief and that rage and that pain and those questions without needing to hurry too quickly to triumph and victory. I wonder if this time in the life of our church, this time of pain with the COVID-19 situation, is a time when we need to be, and perhaps we are beginning actually to do this, to rediscover the power of lament and its value for the emotional life of the church, and actually for the theological richness of what we do when we gather together. The Psalms of Lament are the largest category of psalm within that collection. I wonder if if we have perhaps in the Western Church, because of our relative affluence in global terms, I know that's a generalisation, but in global terms we are relatively affluent and we have relative ease of life. And I wonder if these things have led us to neglect lament and to embrace a slightly triumphalist theology that slides over suffering quickly to declare victory, and actually can leave people who live with suffering and live with pain and live with grief and lived with unfixed illness, and particularly unfixed mental illness. These people can feel quite marginalised in our churches sometimes, and lament allows us to draw them in, to gather them into our worship, and to give them a voice and to share their pain for a while. Lament can be a memorial, as it is here in the book of Lamentations. It can give voice, as I've said. It can be a place for offering confession when the pain that we're experiencing is in some way part of our own or reflection of our own unwisdom in the way we have lived. It is not always that way, of course, but sometimes it is. With climate change, perhaps we might be wanting to confess our own part in that. And it can be a protest to God about, why is the world like this? This isn't how the world is intended to be. So I commend the very beautiful, the very tender book of Lamentations to you today. And maybe you will wish to find it again, or find it for the first time. And maybe it will provide an anchor for your own expression of grief and lament in this time, if you're feeling that. Thank you for joining me today, and we will meet again tomorrow with the book of Ezekiel.